Chapter 1. Emma Williams wished her father could get the house he'd promised her mother built before winter, but there was just no time. Instead, they would winter in a log cabin. Thankfully, Pa had built a loft for her and her sisters. Only problem was it was for her and her sisters. She needed her own space sometimes. Especially now that she was being courted by the most handsome man in their entire community, Jared Appleby. Emma had first developed a crush on Jared when they were still in Independence, Missouri, and she'd thought many times about approaching him to talk to him on their incredibly long journey, but Ma had told her over and over that ladies didn't pursue gentlemen. So, she'd waited for him to come to her, but it was a long wait. But now, everything was wonderful between them. Tonight, she was cooking for him and his family for the first time ever, and she was a little nervous. She couldn't cook as well as her ma, but she'd been learning to cook since she was a young girl. She was making a roast that her brother had brought her from one of the elk he had shot and butchered. She couldn't wait to see his face when he tasted it. Emma was the best cook out of the 3 girls in her family, and she couldn't wait for Jared to lavish her with praises about what a good cook she was. She climbed down the stairs from the loft to see her mother stirring something over the fire. "I was going to start supper for the Applebys, Ma. You can build a fire pit outside. It's chilly, but the fire will keep you warm, and I won't be looking over your shoulder telling you each step. You must learn to cook on your own and not having me looking over your shoulder every time you make a meal." Emma nodded. "Yes, Ma." She took the second large pot from its spot in one corner of the kitchen and put the roast into it. "I'll peel the potatoes and add them. I wish I knew how to bake bread. Your pa was never fond of my bread, so I quit making it years ago, when Roy was a small boy. I'm sure the Appleby family got used to not having bread on the trail." Ma looked up and smiled at her daughter. "You're every bit as good of a cook as I am. Stop being nervous about this. I just want Jared to be so pleased with my meal, he'll drop to one knee and ask me to marry him right then." Emma smiled dreamily as she thought about it. She would love to be married before winter and not have to keep sharing that silly loft. Besides, it would be fun for her and her brother to be married to siblings. Then their children would be cousins on both sides. While she cooked, she fantasized about what a perfect life she'd have with Jared. He was such a sweet man, and he'd lost his mother shortly before they arrived in Clover Creek. She felt terrible for him, but at least he had a sister to cook for them. Now that his sister, Henrietta, was married to her brother, Roy, he and his father and brothers had no one to cook for them. So, she was going to cook for them that evening. Hopefully, he would think even more of her skills as a wife after she'd done so. As she was cooking, Jared walked down the hill. "Hello," she said, looking down and blushing. He'd asked to court her, but they hadn't kissed yet. She hoped she could quit pretending to be shy around him after they kissed. Her ma said it was necessary at least until there had been some physical display of affection, but she also said never to tell her pa if there was a physical display of affection. Her ma confused her at times. She had the meat in the pot, as well as the carrots, and she wanted him to be surprised at the meal she was making, so she hurried to him, away from the fire. He smiled at her, his eyes roaming over her face. "You look beautiful this afternoon," he said. She smiled and remembered to look down in embarrassment. "Thank you. I just wanted to make sure you are still making supper for us tonight. I cannot wait to taste your cooking. Roy told me you were the best cook of all his sisters. My expectations are high." He smiled at her, wishing he could reach out and touch her, but he knew better. Her ma was probably watching them. He would be if she was his daughter. Then his mind wandered to making daughters with her. Or sons. It didn't really matter as long as they were making babies. He wasn't fussy. She smiled demurely, at least she hoped her smile was demure. "I hope I can live up to your expectations." "Me too. I can come down and help you carry supper up to us if you'd like. She nodded. That would be wonderful. The pot is heavy to carry that far uphill. Then I will be here to escort you. He took her hand and bowed over it, brushing his lips across the back of her hand. You shall be my damsel in distress for the evening. She nodded. I can't wait. I don't think I've ever talked to your brothers or your pa. I adore Henri though. Henri is pretty great for a kid sister, he said, grinning. I'll be down around 6. I'll be here. Emma watched Jared as he walked away. She knew she wasn't supposed to be curious about a man's body, but Jared had such broad shoulders, and his bottom looked nice in his work pants. She had to force herself to stop looking and turn around and get back to cooking. She hoped her roast turned out just as well as her ma's always did. On his way up the hill, Jared ran into Henri, who was kindly taking them supper. When he explained that Emma was cooking for them, the look on her face made him nervous. But if she was the best cook of her family, how bad could she really be? He took the food she'd made for their supper, carrying it to his pa's cabin. They'd all agreed to eat together, and Henri made fresh bread daily, which was nice. He knew a lot of women had a hard time making bread over the open fire. Henri followed him into the cabin with a full 10 loaves of bread. That might be enough to hold you until I make more bread, Henri said, smiling sweetly at him. He chuckled. Not if Bastien sees it before Pa does. Pa always hides some of it, so Bastien won't eat it all at once. Henri laughed, shaking her head. I'm going to make our supper now. I hope you have a good evening. I'm sure we will. She was already cooking when I went over there a few minutes ago. I'm sure it will be wonderful. Henri left and headed back down the hill to where she shared a cabin with Roy, her new husband, and Emma's brother. Roy had chosen to build a house that was only a 2-minute walk from his pa, as had he and his brothers. It would be nice to be able to plan out their work schedules more easily. Jared was the oldest brother in the Appleby family. He and his brothers had agreed to start a ranch with their pa. So, while they'd all filed a claim for their own property, they planned to start one huge ranch across all the land together. Unfortunately, Jared's was the last of the 3 cabins he, his father, and his brothers would build before winter. He was getting his own, because he was already very certain that Emma would be his bride, and he wanted to marry before winter set in. He liked the idea of staying in the house during a blizzard with his new bride. Hopefully he could even convince her that clothing was optional, but she seemed much too shy for that. He was sleeping on the floor of Pa's cabin yet. He could probably sleep up in the loft, where a cozy space had been made for Henri, but it just didn't appeal. They'd built it for Henry's height, and the bed had been just the right size for a small woman, not a large man. Jared headed back toward the cabin they were building for him and Emma. He would try to build her a house next summer, but a small cabin would have to do for the winter. But a house would need to be built before the babies started coming. When Jared showed up to help her carry the food up the hill, she put the lid on the pot with the roast and potatoes. She hoped he liked the food as much as her family did. I didn't have time to make a dessert, she said. Honestly, though, her ma had never really taught her to do any baking. Ma had always said it was much too complicated. He took the pot from her and offered her his free arm, which she readily took. She could feel the muscles of his arm through his sleeve, and it made her tingle a little. Wearing her thickest sweater, she shivered a little. While it had been warm during the day, it was so cold at night there. Pa said it was from the high elevation, but she didn't know much about it. How is your cabin coming? She asked. He'd told her that he was building a cabin and hoped she'd be all right with wintering in it until he could build a real house next summer. He sighed. Much slower than I would like. It feels like it's taking 3 times as long as Pa's did. But yours is smaller, she said with a frown. That made no sense to her. Yeah, but we had 4 of us building Pa's. Two of us keep having to work on building a shelter for the cattle. They need to be warm this winter as well. She nodded. As soon as Roy gets enough food in for us for the winter, he's going to help Pa build a barn as well. It's just hard to choose what the most important thing is. It is. We'll all be hunting as soon as my cabin is built. Jared gave her a look that made her tummy quiver. Our cabin. Emma smiled happily, forgetting for a moment to be shy. I'm excited to be able to share it with you. Even if it must be for 2 years, I don't care. We'll be close together in it, which will be nice. Jared grinned. I like the idea of that. He opened the cabin door to his pa's house for her. He wished for a moment that they had the same house they'd had in Indiana, but he knew no one in the community had anything that seemed even a bit like wealth. Perhaps some were richer than others, but you could never tell by looking around at the log cabins that were being erected all over the place. Emma preceded him into the house and looked around, smiling. What's that? She asked, looking at the pot of food he'd brought up the hill earlier, and the huge pile of bread loaves. Henri didn't know you were cooking for us tonight, so she brought supper up for us. We'll have it for lunch tomorrow or supper tomorrow night. But we can have bread with what you made tonight. And butter. We don't have much butter left, but Henri said Roy is building her a butter churn. She'll be making butter for us then, so we can eat some now, knowing it will be replaced soon. Henri seems like she knows so much about cooking. Jared nodded. Oh, she does. Ma was a wonderful cook, but Henri is even better. She is? Emma felt a bit intimidated by how everyone bragged about Henri so much. Jared's father and brothers came in then, stomping their feet. Without Henri there to clean for them, they were being a great deal more careful about the messes they made. Bastien sniffed the air. Something smells good. Sam nodded. Oh, yeah. It will be great to have another good cook in the family. Maybe you and Henri can trade off feeding us. Deep in the pit of her stomach, Emma worried that the good smell was coming from the food Henri had brought and had nothing to do with her cooking. I hope it tastes as good as it smells, she said, her voice small. All these men were used to excellent cooking, and she knew she wasn't as knowledgeable as Henri was. Jared set the pot on the edge of the fireplace and sat down at the table, waiting for his future bride to show off her cooking prowess. His father and brothers joined him. Henri keeps the plates on that shelf there, Jared said, pointing helpfully to the corner of the room. He was hungry and ready for the food to be served. Emma smiled, walked to the corner, and quickly put the cutlery on the table. At least she knew she was doing that correctly. Then she took 5 plates and filled each with her roast, potatoes, and carrots. Oh, and Henri brought bread. She hurried to the bread and brought back 2 loaves along with the butter and a knife to cut the bread. Taking her seat to Jared's right, she looked at the men. She didn't know if they prayed before every meal or not, but her family did. No one was eating, so she bowed her head, waiting for someone to pray. Jared exchanged looks with his father and brothers. They were all looking at the dried-out meat and burnt potatoes and carrots, just as he was. Finally, he bowed his head, saying a prayer for the meal provided. While his father and brothers waited, Jared bravely cut off a bite of the meat, sticking it in his mouth and saying a silent prayer. It wasn't as bad as it looked. It was worse. So much worse. Beside him, Emma was happily eating her meal. Oh, this turned out better than ever, she said. Did you forget to put water in it? Jared asked softly. Oh, I never put water in it. It would make the meat less flavorful. But it would be moist and juicy, Bastien said, keeping his voice soft as well. He knew little about cooking, but even he knew you needed to put water on roast. Emma frowned. It tastes like it's supposed to taste. The other men each ate a bite of the roast, and then tried the carrots and potatoes. Each one chewed the bite and swallowed it. Finally, Bastian said, "This isn't what smelled so good. Is this a joke? Do you have our real meal somewhere else?" He got up and started looking. "Oh, you're a real tease. I found our real meal." He laughed softly. "You shouldn't play tricks on us like that." Bastian put the food Henri had provided on one end of the table, and Mr. Appleby served everyone more food on top of what they had. Emma was mortified, but she didn't correct Bastian's assumption that she'd been playing a trick on them. The worst part of it all was that Jared didn't correct them either, but he did pass his and her plates down to his father to fill. Emma looked at the meal, realizing it was the exact same thing she'd made, but it looked so different. This roast looked moist and smelled so much better than anything she'd ever cooked. When she took her first bite, she almost moaned in pleasure. No wonder they bragged about Henry's cooking. She was a marvel. They all cut up the bread and spread butter, each of them enjoying the meal now that they weren't eating hers. After they'd finished eating, Jared stood. "I'll walk you home. Would you mind leaving the pot with the second roast here, so we can have what's left for lunch tomorrow?" Emma shook her head, absolutely mortified. "Of course not." Jared took the pot with the roast she had made and set the lid back on it. "I'll be back to sleep on your floor in a bit, Pa." Pa nodded. "I'm going to eat a little more. Your sweet girl is as good of a cook as our Henri. I think we're all going to be happy to have two good cooks in the family." Jared waited until they were beyond hearing distance of the house. "Has no one taught you to cook properly?" he asked softly. Emma shook her head, bursting into tears. "I thought I was cooking properly. This is how my ma does it." Jared felt terrible that he'd made her cry. "It doesn't change how I feel about you, but I need to ask you a favor before we can marry." "What's that?" she asked, surprised he still wanted to court her. "Will you go to my sister for cooking lessons? I know it's a lot to ask, but she can show you a few tricks that will make your meals as good as hers in no time." Emma cried harder, but she nodded. "I'll learn anything she's willing to teach me." Jared smiled, stopping, and setting the pot on the ground. He pulled Emma into his arms, and held her, stroking her hair. "I'm sorry you were embarrassed tonight. My family will never know, but I'll need you to improve. Your mother and sisters should probably go with you." Emma nodded, burying her face in his shoulder. "I'm sorry." "Hey, you did nothing wrong. Your mother should be flogged for not teaching you any better, but you cooked the way you were taught." He cupped her cheeks in his hands, and leaned down, brushing a kiss across her lips for the first time. "You're still the girl I want to marry." She pulled a little back, smiling through her tears. "You've never kissed me before." "Well, I hope you like my kisses, because they're going to be coming pretty often." When he left her at the front door, she dumped the food out onto the ground. Now that she knew it wasn't good enough to really eat, and having tasted the difference, she saw no reason to save it. Chapter 2. All the following day, Emma wallowed. She didn't want to help with chores, but she did, doing it silently. She knew she was being mopey, and it wasn't an attractive quality in a young lady, but at that moment, she didn't care. Her whole world had just turned upside down. What she'd believed her entire life had been very wrong. She wiped off the table after the noon meal, which tasted much like the one she'd made for the Applebys the previous evening. When she walked outside to help with hanging the laundry, she spotted the food she'd dumped out. With all the wildlife around, the food should have been gone. It was telling that it wasn't. No one asked her about the food on the ground, and she said nothing. Emma wanted to run to her brother's cabin to talk to Henri, but she'd wait until they came over for supper that night. No point in doing otherwise. By the time Henri had eaten her mother's cooking, she knew the other girl would be looking down on her anyway. How humiliating. She'd believed she was great at keeping house, and here she was, incapable of cooking a decent meal. She hoped she could learn as quickly as Jared seemed to think she should. Thinking of him made her smile, but just a smidge. His kiss the night before had left her wanting so much more from him. She looked forward to the day when they could share a marriage bed. When her mother started a roast for supper, Emma talked to her softly, so her sisters wouldn't hear. "Ma, you're supposed to put water in with a roast, so it doesn't come out dry. And it makes the potatoes and carrots cook better as well." Ma straightened her back up. "Do you realize your pa said the same thing to me this morning, and he told me I had to do it that way from now on? Did you have something to do with that?" Emma's eyes widened. She shook her head. "I didn't, Ma. I swear." She quickly explained what had happened at the Appleby house the night before. "I've never been so embarrassed in my life." Ma shook her head. "There are dozens of ways to cook things. There is no right way. I'm not pleased that family is putting ideas like that in your head." "Sorry, Ma." Emma decided she wouldn't speak until spoken to for the rest of the day. It would give her a little more time to stew in her embarrassment. When Roy and Henri arrived for supper that evening, Henri brought some of the fresh bread she made daily. Emma asked at one point if Henri would teach her to cook, and then she returned to her silence. Emma just hoped she hadn't learned so many bad habits she'd never be able to cook a decent meal. Henri worked with Emma on cooking all day Saturday before her family arrived to have supper. Henri bragged about how well she'd done to her family, and Henri felt as if she'd done something truly remarkable. Emma, Ma, and Emma's sisters Abigail and Barbara spent all day Monday learning to make a turkey feast, and the surprise part for Emma at the end of the day was that everyone enjoyed it. They'd had turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, pies, and everything else they could find that went with turkey. It was a fun day with all of them working together. On Tuesday, Ma, Emma, Abigail, and Barbara were all taking cooking lessons from Henri again. Emma wished she didn't have to share her lessons with her sisters, but it made sense. They'd been taught to cook the same way she had. Emma had never realized how young Ma had been when her own mother died. There'd been no time for Ma to learn to cook properly, which explained why she'd never taught Emma to do better than she had. Emma was truly excited to learn to cook from someone who was as good a cook as Henri was. As Henri taught them, Ma would watch, and then run outside to a fire she'd started and do the same thing with the meal she was cooking. Emma helped as much as she could, but it seemed everyone thought Ma learning to cook was a higher priority than Emma learning. Halfway through the day, Emma found her answer. "Henri, would it be all right if I cooked for your family? Then I could follow what you do as well." Henri looked at Emma with a huge grin on her face. "I think that's a brilliant idea. It's better if everyone can be hands-on as they learn." Emma grinned. "Thanks. I'm going to go build another fire." Barbara sighed. "What can I do?" "You can help your sister gather some wood for kindling, and then you can help her carry what she needs for supper outside," Henri said to the youngest of the Williams sisters. Abigail had helped whenever she could. She'd even kneaded bread, while Barbara had looked confused as to what she should be doing. "Can I just keep helping where I see I can?" Abigail asked softly. She was the middle sister and was much shyer than the other two. Henri nodded. "You're doing great. After Emma marries Jared, you'll have plenty of time to learn to cook yourself." Abigail nodded. "Emma needs to learn first so she can get married." "I agree." The ladies had a fun day, learning and working together. At the end of the day, they all tried a small bit of all three meals. Emma was surprised that hers tasted almost as good as Henry's, though Ma's wasn't quite as good as either of the others. Emma knew her Ma hated to cook with everything inside her, but she'd taught them to clean and sew beautifully. And Emma knew how to take care of a baby with two younger sisters, and she had helped with some of the babies along the trail. It had been fun for her to visualize the babies and imagine they were hers and Jared's. "I'm going to carry this up the hill to your family," Emma said, pleased with her own cooking, and finally being certain her family would be pleased as well. Henri smiled. They're going to love it. She looked for the bread she'd baked and wrapped 4 loaves in a large cloth. I'll walk with you. Thank you, Emma said. We'll switch the pot back and forth. It's heavy for one person. Your help will be most welcome. Do you think they'll like the rice and stew we made? Emma asked. They have always liked it when I made it, and yours was just as good as mine. Emma knew it wasn't true, but she took the compliment. Learning to season things seems to be the hardest, she said. I couldn't quite get the exact taste of yours. Henri chuckled. I never have the exact same taste twice. I measure when I bake, but not so much when I cook. You'll see what I mean as you get more confident with yourself. Please don't tell anyone the supper we all ate on Thursday night was cooked by you, Emma said softly. Bastian looked at my meal and decided it must have been a trick I was playing on them. Jared knew better, but he didn't say anything. Don't worry. I know better than telling the family my sister couldn't cook until this weekend. Emma felt proud to be called Henry's sister. Thank you. I'm glad you're here and willing to help so much. This year has been so difficult for all of us. We women will have much more difficult jobs out west than we ever did in the east. We all need to learn together and work together to get things done. For instance, I see the little butterfly on the collar of your dress. Did you make that? Henri asked. Emma nodded. Ma sews really well, and she's taught me. I would love to learn to do something like that. Perhaps you could teach me after I teach you to cook. Emma was thrilled to have something to offer. Did you make the dress you're wearing? She asked. I did, Henri replied. But sewing is difficult, tedious work for me. I prefer to cook. Your new curtains look beautiful, Emma said. I can sew a straight line really well. Emma laughed. I'll teach you everything I know. I'm excited that we can learn together. So am I, Henri said. Let me take the pot. We're about halfway. You take the bread. As they exchanged, Emma shook her arm a little. I don't know how you carry so many meals up here to your family. That's hard work. Usually, one of my brothers will meet me coming up the hill, or they'll just come by at the end of their workday and take it up. They could eat with us, but they seem to want us to have more privacy as newlyweds. Emma bit her lip, wondering how indelicate it would be for her to ask the question on her mind. Do you like sharing a bed with my brother? Henri blushed. I do. When it was obvious to Emma the subject bothered Henri, she decided not to ask anything more on the topic, so she quickly changed the subject. How many meals should I go into a marriage being able to make? Henri thought for a moment before answering. You can make 2 breakfasts now. You'll want to learn more, but if you just alternate the 2, Jared will be happy. He can make scrambled eggs and bacon as well, so he can show you those things if you want. You don't only have a couple of things you can make now, though. You can make gravy from jerky and put it over rice. Or mashed potatoes. So that's 2 meals. You can make a beautiful roast. You can make stew. Tomorrow, I'll teach you to make a filling soup. I think you could marry Jared this week and be just fine. We'll keep working on things until you know just what you're doing. Jared told me I should have you teach me to cook, Emma said. I was so embarrassed I couldn't quit crying, and he didn't get angry. He just told me what I should do to get better. He was very kind. Henri smiled. I'm glad. I'd have to say something otherwise. Do you think the 2 of you will marry soon? Maybe after he eats my stew tonight. Henri giggled. I don't always make rice with my stew, but rice keeps for a long time. By serving the stew with rice and bread, it makes the meal stretch much further. I have little things like that I'll teach you as we go along. You need to be able to make food stretch as far as it possibly can. Will you teach me how to salt meat? Emma asked. Ma only knows how to dry it, and I would like a variety. I've made a deal with your ma that she will make my jerky, and I'll salt meat for her. Then we'll all have a variety through the winter. But yes, I'd be thrilled to teach you to salt meat. We do need more jars, though. Where will we get some? Emma asked. Now that they were in Oregon Territory, there was no real place for them to shop. She didn't know what she would be able to do about jars. I'm not sure. I know Ma told the boys to each bring a couple of dozen because their wagons weren't quite as full as ours, but I'm not sure they listened. Henri shook her head. Men rarely listen. Emma laughed. If they did bring them, will they let us use them? Henri nodded. I shouldn't have borrowed from your ma before asking them anyway. But they would have brought them expecting someone else to use them. Henri pushed the door open and stepped into the house, putting the huge pot they'd carried next to the fireplace so it could be heated up. I wish someone was here. Someone like me? Jared asked, his voice even deeper than Emma remembered. His voice made her tingle all over. Before Emma could respond, Henri said, You'll do. Jared ignored his sister. What are you doing here? He asked Emma. Henri has spent the whole weekend teaching me to cook. I made your supper tonight, and though it's not as good as Henry's, I think everyone will like it. Jared raised an eyebrow. It sure smells good. You made it? He had to be certain because her last meal had been such a fiasco. Emma nodded. I did. And I helped make the bread today as well. He smiled happily. My cabin was finished today. Do you think you need another week or two to learn to cook? Or could we get married tomorrow? She bit her lip. I think we could get married tomorrow. I'll keep learning from Henri as we go. Her house isn't far. It's about a 10-minute walk. I think that will usually be okay. He thought for a moment. I'm going to make you a sled. Sled down the hill on it every day, and I'll bring it back up at the end of my day. I don't want you slipping on the ice. She laughed, thinking for a moment he was joking. Sure, I'll sled down to her. I'm serious. It'll be easier than slipping and falling. Or would you rather I made you snowshoes? Henri responded for Emma. She needs both. I love that we live so close, but that hill is awfully steep. Both it is. Jared said. I'm trying to plan my wedding here, dear sister. What do you want me to do? I can go outside and wait while you two make your plans. Or I can just go home. Wait outside. We'll talk fast. Henri humped under her breath, but she went out the door. Jared took both of Emma's hands in his. I asked your pa at church on Sunday. He's agreed if you would like to be my wife. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She'd known it was coming, but it was so special. I'd love to be your wife. She'd remember this moment for the rest of her life and tell her daughters all about how their pa had asked her to marry him. Jared gathered her close and kissed her in a much more passionate way than he had the first time. Her stomach was on fire before he ended the kiss. I'll come get you tomorrow morning. We're taking my horse because it will be better than hitching up a wagon. I'm worried we'll get snow any day. My pa's been saying the same thing. I'll be ready. I don't think we should have anyone go along with us, he said. We can't ask people to slow down their work. Winter is too close. I thought I smelled snow this morning. My ma could always tell when snow was about to fall by the smell. She grinned. My ma says it's nonsense. Be ready for me at 8. I'll talk to Pastor Jed tonight. Never in his life had he referred to a pastor by his first name, but it just seemed right with Jed. They were around the same age, and Jed was a man who was easy to approach. I'll be waiting for you. I can't wait to see my new home. He laughed. It looks like all the other homes around here. You'll have to use my pa's cellar. Henri was going to teach me to salt meat tomorrow. You can still go. I even brought 24 jars at my mother's insistence. I think my brothers did too. We were going to ask you that. Now you don't have to. Jared sighed. Just one more night of sleeping alone, and he would have his sweet Emma in his arms. With one last kiss, he went outside. You two walk home together. I want to put a couple of last-minute touches on the cabin so it will be ready for my beautiful bride. Henri grinned at Emma. I'm so excited we're going to be double sisters. Emma laughed. And our children will be double cousins. Life sure does take some strange twists and turns, doesn't it? It does. As they walked down the hill, Emma felt like she was floating on air. Jared won't change his mind if he hates the meal I cooked this evening, will he? She asked. Henri shook her head. No, he won't. He's not that kind of man. I sure hope you're right. I still worry about my cooking and what he expects in the way of food. I need to learn fast and get your receipts written down. We didn't write anything Monday or today. You only need exact receipts for baking. The kind of cooking we did yesterday and today, other than the pie crusts, was just throwing things into the pot as we went along. You'll see how easy it is. Emma nodded. I sure hope you're right. Chapter 3. Emma was up earlier than usual the next morning. She had so much nervous energy. She wanted to be Jared's wife more than anything, but she worried she wouldn't be a good enough wife to him. She only ate a few bites at breakfast and drank a couple of cups of coffee, which was unusual for her. She wasn't a fan of coffee, but her father was insisting they still drink either coffee or tea. He didn't trust the water they were drinking. He claimed that everyone who had gotten sick along the trail hadn't drunk coffee or tea, and he wasn't going to see his family take as ill as the others. She had no idea if he was right or wrong about drinking coffee or tea, but she knew she had to obey her father. It was as simple as that. And in a few hours, she would promise to obey Jared for the rest of her life. Emma had to wonder if it was really necessary for women to obey men, or if it was something some man had come up with and all others had agreed with. She felt as if she had a mind that could think as well as any man's. Not that she would ever think of disobeying either her father or her husband. She just wondered why men thought women had to be obedient. She helped her mother with the morning dishes and put all the things she brought west in a hope chest back into the chest. Her brother had made room in his wagon for her valuable things, and she was pleased she would have them. She had collected dishes, pots and pans, linens, and she'd even made a special dress to be married in before leaving Iowa. The dress had been taken in the previous evening. She hadn't realized just how much leaner she was after her 2,000-mile walk across the West. Pa and Roy were outside when Jared arrived, and they hoisted the chest into the back of Jared's wagon. "Why did you bring a wagon?" she called. "I thought we were going to ride a horse." She'd been looking forward to clinging to him as they drove down the hill and to the church. "My pa told me that was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard, and a lady should be driven to her wedding, not ride a horse. I wasn't going to argue with him, so I'm here in a wagon." Jared was at her side when he finished speaking. "You look beautiful today. I can't wait to begin our life together." Emma smiled. "I guess supper was to your satisfaction last night then?" He laughed. "My whole family thought Henri had made it, and when I told them it was you, they weren't even surprised." "Well, then I'm happy. I'm supposed to go to Henry's house as soon as I settle in. Apparently, my brother got another elk yesterday, and I'm going to learn how to salt meat. We'll have it for our winter." He handed her up into the wagon. "That's wonderful. But for just the next hour, let's not even think about our winter preparations. Let's just be happy and celebrate the fact we're getting married." She turned and waved to her brother and father, feeling as if she'd never see them again, which was ridiculous. They lived just a few-minute walk down the hill, and apparently, she was going to have snowshoes and a sled before winter to get down and up the hill with. As they drove, she said, "I can't believe how nervous I am. I want nothing more than to be your wife, but my stomach is all aflutter. I'm about to promise to love you and obey you for the rest of our lives. Make sure you don't tell me to do anything stupid, all right?" He laughed. "I wouldn't. If you're worried, though, we can postpone this for a few more days." Jared truly wasn't sure if he could wait that long before marrying her, but if it would calm her nerves, her feelings must come first. It was something he'd been taught since he was a child. "No, I don't want to wait, but that doesn't make me any less nervous." When he stopped the wagon in front of the church the entire community had erected just weeks before, she moved toward the edge to jump down as she had so often, but he was there with his hands raised to help her down. It was like he believed she really was a lady, when she felt like a little girl inside. With his hands at her waist, he lifted her down from the wagon, and she couldn't help but smile. Inside the church, Pastor Jed and his wife Hannah were there, as was Fiona Jefferson, a girl Emma knew from the trail. She smiled at the other ladies as she approached the front of the church. She remembered Fiona was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jefferson, who planned to farm there. They had a plot of land just south of the church, whereas Emma and Jared's families had chosen land just north of the church. The church itself they'd built right there on the trail. Then the next wagon trains who came through could worship with them if they had a desire to. Jared and Emma took their places in front of Pastor Jed, and Emma took a deep breath. She couldn't believe how very nervous she was to marry the man she'd been dreaming of marrying for well over 2,000 miles. The pastor's kind eyes looked at them both. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Emma nodded. And so, the wedding began. When it was time for Jared to kiss his new bride, he pulled her to him, and his kiss was much more passionate and more exciting than she thought was proper for a church. He didn't break off until the pastor cleared his throat. Emma was dazed as he broke the kiss, and she swayed a little on her feet. Being married to her Jared would never be boring. She looked up into his eyes and thought for a moment about pulling his head down for one more kiss, but she could feel people's eyes on her. Instead, she walked over to Mrs. Scott and Fiona. "Thanks for being the witnesses for our wedding." Hannah laughed, slowly getting to her feet. "I will always be happy to do what I can for you. It looks like you've found true happiness with Jared. Isn't he the eldest of the Appleby boys?" "Yes, he is," Emma agreed. "You look like that babe's going to be born any day." "Oh, don't say that." The doc and Mrs. Mitchell agree that it'll be at least another month. "I've been sewing up a storm since we finally arrived here. I love that our home is right here in the church for now, but I hope one day I'll be raising children in a real house." "How many children do you want?" Emma asked. "As many as the Lord gives me." "Perfect answer for a pastor's wife," Fiona said. "I want an even dozen, but we're running out of eligible men around here. I don't want to have to start looking to the Indians to find a husband." The three women laughed at that. "I hope it doesn't come to that," Emma said. "Remember Jared's got 2 younger brothers." Fiona shook her head. "That Bastian looks like he'd be big trouble. Samuel, though, he's quieter, which might be scarier even. You don't know what to expect from him." "No, I think I'll keep my eyes off those Appleby boys." Emma laughed. "Well, if you change your mind, I'm happy to provide an introduction. I don't think you're supposed to be trying to be a matchmaker on your wedding day. Go on and be happy," Fiona said, waving Emma away. Hannah hugged Emma. "Be happy, my friend." Emma had tears in her eyes as she turned away. She wasn't so certain about Fiona, but Hannah had been very sincere in her instructions to be happy. Emma would do all she could to follow those instructions. Out in the wagon, they headed up to where the hill leveled off, where her parents and brother had settled, and then up to the next part of the hill where her in-laws had settled. It would be good to be as close to family as she was, but also enough apart that they would have the privacy a newlywed couple required. He drove her in front of a small log cabin, much like her brother's, and he walked around, caught her by the waist, and kissed her while she dangled there in midair before setting her on the ground. "I have to get to your sister's to help her with the salting of the meat," she said, wishing she could beg him to go inside so they could consummate the marriage. But she was an adult now, and it was important that she learn to work before she played. He nodded. "I need to get the horses in the barn. It was finished a couple of days ago. It's big enough for our herd for this winter, though it's a little lopsided. Next year we'll have to build a real one. Maybe someone will start a sawmill. We can use one. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have real houses, and not just log cabins?" she asked, thinking far into the future. He frowned a bit. "I hope you'll be happy here in the meantime." She smiled. "If I'm with you, I can't imagine being anything but happy." He leaned down and kissed her one more time. "I'll see you at supper time. I'll be eating the rest of that stew with my father and brothers while you learn with Henri." "All right. I'm sure Henri and I will come up with something delicious." As Emma walked down the hill, toward Henri and Roy's cabin, she realized she didn't feel any different. She was a married woman now, and she'd expected to suddenly feel all grown up and ready to conquer the world when she was married, but she still felt like plain old Emma Williams. When she got to Henry's, she was surprised that her mother and sisters were there, and there was lunch on the table for all 5 of them. "What's this?" she asked. Henri smiled. "We thought a wedding lunch with just us ladies would be nice. And we all forgot about learning to churn butter yesterday, so your sisters will stay, and the 4 of us will take turns at the butter churn, and I'll teach you about salting meat. Your mother has taken a share, and she's going to spend the afternoon in a quiet house, making her jerky. But first, lunch." It was the same meal Henri had taught Emma to make for lunch just Saturday. It was a jerky-based gravy and served over rice. But Emma saw it had been made over mashed potatoes. She was certain Henri was trying to show her how to serve variations of each meal. "Well, this is lovely. Thank you all." Instead of letting Emma help serve, her sisters and Henri served her mother and herself. The meal was wonderful, and full of laughter. "Why do we never just take time to enjoy each other?" Emma asked. "There's never any time," Ma told her. "But there will be here in the West. There will be lots of hard work, of course, but we'll also have time to visit with one another and share our days." Henri nodded. "It seems so strange to settle into a new town, where we already know everyone, doesn't it?" Emma nodded. "Fiona Jefferson was at the church this morning, and I thought the same thing. We just started a settlement with people that already feel like friends and family. I know I would have written to so many people if we'd settled apart, but now we can all just live in the same area happily." Her mother nodded and smiled, waiting until everyone was seated. "I'll pray." Every head bowed, and her mother thanked God for the meal and for sending a wonderful family into their lives, thanking God for her 2 new children, Henri and Jared. When they raised their heads, Henri had a couple of tears on her cheeks. "I feel honored to be part of your family," she said softly. They ate their meal slowly, and when they were finished, Barbara and Abigail got up and brought something they'd hidden out of sight before Emma arrived. "A cake?" she asked, excited. "We never have cake." Ma laughed. "I know how to make one now, so you won't be able to say that any longer." Emma was thrilled that her mother was taking to the new cooking lessons so well, even though she knew her mother hated to cook more than anything. After the cake, her mother pulled something out from under one of Henry's pillows. "I started this when I realized you and Jared would be courting." It was a beautiful nightgown with lace all over the bodice, and it was sleeveless. It looked positively indecent to Emma, who stared at it in shock. "Wear this tonight," her mother said, saying nothing more. Yes, Ma, Emma said softly. How strange it was to have her mother make something that looked like a loose woman should wear it. It was beautiful, and she knew Jared would love it, but it still surprised her. Had Ma once worn something like that for Pa? Henri eyed the nightgown. Oh, that's so beautiful, Mrs. Williams. I wish I had the talent to sew, as well as you do. Ma Williams smiled. I was hoping you'd say something like that. She walked to the bed and pulled out a nightgown that was very similar to Emma's. I made this for you for your wedding night, but I didn't know if you would feel comfortable wearing it. I brought it today, hoping you would like Emma's. Henry's eyes filled with tears again. It's beautiful. Thank you so much. When you finish the cooking lessons and we can all feed our menfolk, would you allow me to teach you some of my sewing tricks? Ma asked. Henri nodded emphatically. I can't think of anything I'd like more. Maybe we could do a cooking lesson Mondays, a sewing lesson Tuesdays, and a baking lesson on Thursdays. I heard a rumor that the church is going to start a regular quilting circle every Thursday, and I think we should all be part of that. I hadn't realized just how many people on the trail with us that I only knew by sight. I don't know anything about them, and we're spending our lives together in this little community. I think it will be a great way for us all to get to know one another. I think so too. Ma said. Are children welcome or only married ladies? Henri laughed. If the married ladies are going, who will watch the children if they can't come? That's a very good point, Emma said. Do you know Fiona Jefferson very well? Everyone looked at one another and shook their heads. No, not at all. We stayed to ourselves too much on that trail, Ma said. Abigail nodded at that. We really did. Well, she was one of the witnesses to my marriage today, and she said something that surprised me. She wants an even dozen children, and she talked like she planned to have exactly that many, no more, no less. Henri nodded. I talked to her a few times. She seems to know exactly what she wants out of life in a way that is odd for a woman. I must wonder how her future husband will feel about her. I hope he'll love her, despite how odd she seems to me, Emma said. She couldn't imagine being in a marriage with a man who didn't love her. Though, she was sitting at the table on her wedding day, realizing she and Jared had never said they loved one another. How odd. Ma stood up. I'm going to go home and make this exact thing for supper, because I know how to make it now. And I'll do it over rice. Thanks for giving me instructions on the correct way to make rice. I don't know why I thought I was supposed to fry it up. Always happy to help when I can, Mrs. Williams, Henri said, getting to her feet to embrace her mother-in-law. Thank you for the beautiful gown. You're very welcome, Ma said. You girls finish the butter and then come home. Abigail nodded. Yes, Ma. Barbara didn't respond, but that was typical for Barbara. She was thinking about other things. All right, Henri said, getting to her feet. Let's get this butter churned, and then we'll do a bit of the meat. We spent longer on lunch than planned, but we couldn't not have a wedding celebration. Henri showed the girls how to skim the cream off the top of the milk, and then she poured the cream into her new butter churn. Then all we do is take turns stirring it with this huge paddle, she explained. The longer you stir, the harder it gets, not only because your arms get tired, but also because the cream is getting thicker and turning into butter. Back home, Ma and I had started buying it at the store in town. I'm not looking forward to having to make my own again. Barbara took the first turn. I think I'm going to like churning butter. Henri nodded, but she looked skeptical. Now we need to salt the meat, Henri said. We're going to go out and cut off roast-size pieces of the meat. Your family will need a larger size, as will my family. You and I will need smaller roasts. Emma nodded. All right. She took a long piece of wood out to the elk carcass hanging upside down from a tree, and she cut off a roast-sized portion. Is that good? I would think we'll want that size for your family and my family. We won't be able to have a lot of meat with each meal, though hopefully the men will be able to get more before it's too cold to hunt. Emma cut off one more chunk the same size as the first, and two that were about half the size. Is that good? She asked. She was surprised how easy it was for her to handle raw meat after her mother had taught her to never touch it. Life was different here than it had been back home, but she was starting a new life today. And she couldn't be happier. Chapter 4. Emma headed home an hour before supper time. She wanted to make certain she could make something delicious, but she did take some of the bread Henri had made that morning to complete her meal. As someone who had grown up with little bread, she was surprised at how very much it added to a meal. As soon as she was in her new cabin, she looked around at the room. There was little there. There were shelves along the walls on either side of the fireplace, and she had no idea why her pa and Roy hadn't added something like that. It made things so much easier. She set the bread on the table, because they would eat it for supper, and she put her share of the butter they'd made that afternoon beside it. It would mean at least one portion of the meal was good. She went to her hope chest and pulled out the dishes and pots and pans she'd brought with her from Iowa. Emma had no idea when they left home that she would marry so quickly, and her pa had tried to get her to leave her hope chest, but she'd dug in her heels. Now she was so thankful she had it with her. Then she took some of the jerky her ma had provided, and she carefully followed Henry's directions for making it into a thick, meat-filled gravy. After she'd gotten it boiling, she wanted to kick herself. She should have started the rice first, because it took so much longer. Cooking definitely wasn't second nature to her as it was to Henri, but hopefully it would be soon. Thankfully, Jared was a little later than expected, and the rice was finished before he walked in the door, looking exhausted from his day of work. He walked to her and wrapped his arms around her from behind, his whole body pressed up against her back. "Hello," she whispered, leaning back a little. She wanted to feel him up against her front, but they had to eat first. She didn't want the food ruined. "I'm hungry." For both the food and for her. He couldn't believe he'd waited so long to have her as his wife, and the day had finally arrived. She laughed softly. "If you're anything like my brother, you're always hungry. Go sit down, and I'll get supper on the table." "What did you make?" he asked. "I'm still learning, so I made something very simple." "I hope that's all right." "Of course, it is." Jared turned her in his arms to kiss her. "I don't expect you to cook as well as my sister after less than a week of learning." "That's a very good thing," Emma said, her arms around his neck. "We need to eat before we can get on to more interesting things." "Like?" She smiled, and she was certain it was a wicked-looking smile. "Going to bed early." "Just what I was thinking." "Then sit down, so I can feed you." She put the food on the table in 2 bowls. Having set the table while the rice was cooking, all she had to do was sit down. She reached out and took his hand in hers for their prayer. He immediately bowed his head and prayed for the wonderful meal in front of him. When he lifted his head, he took a generous helping of the rice and poured gravy over it. "Would you mind passing me a piece of that bread?" Emma grabbed the bread and sliced off 2 pieces, spreading the fresh butter over both. She'd expected to keep one for herself, but he took both, so she sliced off another piece for her. The bread had been baked in a skillet, so it was rather flat and round, but it worked because it was delicious. She looked at him as she took her first bite, and realized his meal was already half gone. She certainly hoped she'd cooked enough for them. Taking her first bite, she realized the food was good, and she sighed with relief. Maybe it wasn't as good as Henry's yet, but she sure liked it. "You did a great job on supper," Jared said as he spooned another huge helping onto his plate. "Did Henri help at all?" "She made the bread this morning, but other than that, it was all me." "Well, and my mother's jerky. It all tastes great." "Who knew you were such a good cook?" She laughed. I sure wasn't a week ago. Now that I've tasted the difference, I'll always be glad Henri was so willing to teach me. Me too, he said, grinning at her. I'm a better seamstress than Henri, she said. Maybe it wasn't the time, but she needed him to know she wasn't completely inept at being a wife. She just hadn't learned to cook yet. Good. She always messed up when she made shirts. She and Ma both hated to have to do tedious sewing work. They loved to cook and clean and do other wifely things, but sewing was not something they were fond of. You could always tell when I tore a shirt that they were disappointed it would need to be mended. Really? I could make a business sewing shirts. I love to sit with a needle in my hand and just sew all day. But I have a feeling you'll want to eat often. 3 times a day maybe? He laughed. Yes, it would be nice if you didn't mind feeding me. I'll probably do lunch with my pa and brothers though. Then we can just eat whatever was made the night before. She titled her head to one side. Are they going to expect Henri and me to provide meals every night? Probably. You should work it out with Henri. She did make sure we all knew how to make one breakfast and one supper, just in case we had to feed ourselves, but the truth is, none of us have enough energy to cook at night after a long day of work. What did you do today? She asked, very curious. We're still working on finishing up the barn. It's a log barn, and it looks quite odd to be truthful, but it works. He nodded to the other end of the table. Would you mind buttering another piece of bread for me? Not at all. 1 or 2? 2. When do you think the barn will be ready for winter? She asked. By the end of the week. We're going to have to put the horses in with the cattle for the winter, but hopefully they won't fight too much. His grin told her he was joking. That wouldn't be good. What will you feed them through the winter? We have sacks of dried corn we brought from home. By the time we got here, the grass was too wet to make hay with it, so we won't be able to use that. On any days that it's nice out, we'll let them roam. And we'll pray. A lot. We don't have a huge herd, but we have a bull and a couple dozen heifers. It doesn't sound like much, and it's not, but it's enough to get us started. Bastian tried to convince us we should shoot one of the heifers, and we almost lost our minds. I don't know what that brother of mine is thinking. I wonder if it would be possible to have some buffalo as well. Their meat is amazing, as we all know. And they're bigger, so you get more meat from each one. He grinned. We've talked about sectioning off a bit of land in the spring to do that. I've heard it's difficult, but it would be good to have another source of income for a while if we could make it work. I think that's really smart. When he finished his 3rd plate of food, he sat back in his chair and patted his stomach. That was delicious, Emma. The compliment made her feel as if she'd just brought in one of the buffalo he wanted all on her own. I'm so glad you liked it. I'm going to get the dishes done, so we can get on to the fun part of our evening. You're not even a little bit shy about what we're going to do, are you? Emma shrugged. Not really. Do you want me to be? Jared laughed softly. Not particularly. I'm just a little surprised you seem to be looking forward to it as much as I am. I'm excited more than anything. She made short work of the dishes, so she could take part in what she hoped would be the most wonderful night of her life. Henri was really nervous. I got that impression. I tried to talk to her about it once, knowing I would be married soon, and I wanted to know what she thought of it, but she blushed and changed the subject. My ma was always really open with us about what it was like to be with a man, and she makes it sound like she'd rather do that than sew. And if it's that much fun, I'm ready to get on with that portion of our wedding day. I was expecting a blushing little bride who wouldn't want me to see her even in her nightgown. Emma laughed. That is not what you're getting at all. I wouldn't even bother with a nightgown, but the one Ma made me for our wedding night is so beautiful I have to wear it for at least a minute. Just so you can take it off me. He chuckled. I'll happily do that. She put the last of the dishes on the shelves and turned to him. All right. You need to go for about 10 minutes so I can get that gown on. Are you sure I can't just watch you change into it? He wouldn't mind that a bit. I'm positive. Now go walk, and I'll be ready for you when you get back. Jared wasn't sure what to think about his bride who didn't have any worries about her wedding night. He walked to her and kissed her deeply. Make it 5 minutes. She laughed. I hope you know we're taking it slow and easy tonight. I expect to kiss every inch of your body before you make love to me. Jared's eyes widened. That sounds good to me. And we'll be making love with each other. With that, he closed the door and walked out to the barn. Why he went there, he didn't know, but it seemed to make more sense to him than standing out in the cold. The horses were there, and he gave each a pat on the nose. There were 4, one each for his brothers, Pa, and himself. They hadn't moved the herd in quite yet, hoping they would be able to eat the grass still on the ground for as long as possible before they had to switch to feeding them corn. With one last pat on his favorite horse's nose, he walked slowly back to the cabin. It felt like it had been at least a half hour since he left, but he knew it was probably between 5 and 10 minutes. Never in his life had he dreamed he would find a bride who was as eager for lovemaking as he was. When he opened the door, he saw the lanterns had been turned down, but there was a candle lit on the chest she'd brought with her that day. It was in a corner on the far side of the bed, but it gave out enough light that he could see her. He pushed his suspenders down each arm, as his eyes looked for her, and finally he saw her standing on the other side of the bed. His eyes widened when he realized that the top of her nightgown was only lace. He could see right through it to her small pink nipples. As he walked toward her, his hands were at the collar of his shirt, and he unbuttoned the top button. She walked toward him and swatted his hands away. I believe that's my job. Is it now? Jared was surprised by his little bride more than he could say. He dropped his hands to his sides and stood there quietly while she went to work on the buttons of his shirt. May I just say how much I love your nightgown, and I hope you'll wear it every night for the rest of our lives. Emma grinned. Ma gave it to me at lunch today, and I was so excited. She didn't mention that Ma had made one for Henri as well because she didn't need him thinking of his sister just then. He reached out and caught one of her nipples between his thumb and forefinger, rolling it. It makes me see much of what I want to see. She sucked in a breath as he caught her nipple. Now, I like that. He chuckled. I can see you're going to enjoy this night as much as I can. I sure hope so. Ma said it might hurt the first time, but I should just remember how much pleasure there is to be had in our marriage bed. His eyes widened. She really told you that? He knew his mother would never have said anything like that to Henri. As soon as the thought crossed his mind, he shook his head. He didn't want to think about family, not with his beautiful wife in front of him undressing him. Emma laughed. Ma said that too many mothers tell their daughters that they should just close their eyes and think of something else while their husband was inside them. She told me to never be that way because there was too much pleasure that I would miss out on. With as hard as life in the West will be on women, I love to know that there will be pleasure in your arms. She finished unbuttoning his shirt and pushed it off his shoulders and let it drop on the floor. Her fingers immediately found his nipple, and she rolled it the same way he had hers. She watched his face and saw he enjoyed it just as much as she did. Emma, if you're this aggressive the whole time, it might be over too quickly. Then we'll just have to try again, won't we? She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him, wanting to feel every moment of pleasure that was available to her. I think you're overdressed, he said. My shirt is gone, but you're still covered, after a fashion. I'm afraid this nightgown was made to get into easily, but I just can't take it off myself. His laughter surprised him. You're going to make this fun, aren't you? Jared knew he'd chosen well when they shared their first kiss, but this? He didn't care if she couldn't cook. He'd eat burnt meals 3 times a day if she was this excited with their lovemaking. Her smile transformed her face from simply pretty to beautiful. I sure hope so. He kissed her, then left a trail of kisses from her mouth to her shoulder, where a slim strap was holding her nightdress in place. He slowly lowered the strap, and his lips moved to the same place where he'd touched her through her nightgown. He drew her nipple into his mouth and suckled softly at her breast. As she looked down at him, she felt a flood of heat going to her core. Her knees felt weak, and she understood then why this was done in bed. She didn't have the strength to stand. Her moan was loud and surprised her, but it just seemed to make him more intent on suckling. She backed toward the bed, and he followed. I think I'm going to end up on the floor if we keep standing. He chuckled, but followed her down onto the bed. We didn't finish the undressing portion of our fun? I suppose that's going to happen in bed then. A challenge. I like challenges. He peeled the strap on her other side down, not being nearly as attentive this time. All he wanted was to see his beautiful wife without her nightgown. It had shown him a lot, but not nearly enough. She lifted her hips as he pulled the gown down over them, and then he knelt on the bed and just stared at her in all her glory. I have never seen anything as beautiful as you look right now in my entire life. Well, take your pants off then. I want to see too. He was positive she shouldn't be saying anything like that, but what did it matter? It was only the two of them, and he may want a lady during the day, but he wanted a lover at night, and as far as he was concerned there was nothing they couldn't say or do together. He stood beside the bed, surprised at how weak his own knees were. Unbuttoning his pants, he let them fall to his feet, even as he pushed his underwear down. He knew his member stood at attention, and he was a bit worried it would scare her, but she smiled as if he'd just given her a present. As soon as he was back on the bed and once again kneeling beside her, she took him in her hand, stroking his flesh softly. I don't think that's a good idea, he told her. Oh, but it's so soft. I think I like it. He closed his eyes and just let her touch. She was in no hurry for this night to end, so if he lost his control now, he had a feeling there would be no problem returning to his state. Chapter 5. Emma abruptly let go and pulled Jared down beside her, kissing him with all she was worth. Slow and steady wins the race, she said softly. He was shocked at all she seemed to know about how a man's body worked, but he was starting to believe every woman should enter their marriage with the knowledge this slip of a girl had in her head. When his hands moved to explore her down between her legs, she arched her hips and moaned softly. She didn't seem to mind when he moved his fingers along her core and even moved one inside her. She clutched at his shoulders and pulled his head down to her, kissing him instead. That feels so strange and good and strange all at once. Strange and you want me to stop? Or strange and you want me to keep going? Jared worried he was moving too fast for her, but he'd expected the whole thing to last 10 minutes, and it certainly wasn't working out that way. More please. He chuckled. How about I replace my fingers with something else? Not yet, she said. Just a little more playing with each other. He groaned. You're killing me. I'm not sure how much longer I can last. Think of how good it will feel when it's time. Emma moved her hands to his broad shoulders. She'd noticed them before she'd even noticed his face, and touching them, well, it brought her joy. Her hands moved all over his back and down to his bottom, which she cupped in her hands. I like touching you. His mouth met hers in another kiss, this one more deeply passionate than ever before. It felt as if he was trying to imitate what he would be doing to her body in just a bit. His fingers were still inside her, and she felt pressure building in her as well, but she didn't want his fingers in her when she experienced the miracle her mother had told her would happen. She moved his hand away, and very hoarsely said, "Now would be good." Jared didn't have to be told twice. He covered her body with his own and moved into her as slowly as he could possibly manage. When she gasped and arched into him, his eyes widened, and he began moving within her. She wrapped her legs around his waist to feel him even deeper within her. There was a little pain, but she knew what was coming, and she wanted it desperately. She felt herself rising ever higher, and she arched her entire body when the miracle happened. As soon as he saw she'd reached her pleasure, he moved faster, and only cared about his own pleasure. He finished quickly, and moved to her side, afraid of crushing her. "I liked feeling you on top of me," she protested. "You're going to be the death of me, Emma Appleby." She smiled with pleasure at her new name. "I like the sound of that. My new name." Pulling her to him, he wasn't even a little bit surprised when she threw her leg over him and snuggled even closer. "Our wedding night was so much more than I thought it could possibly be. Thank you for that." She made a little humming sound in her throat. "Just wait until I figure out what I'm doing." She was content to lay there as close to him as she possibly could, knowing his seed was inside her, and she could already be expecting his baby. Of course, she'd rather put off childbirth for a little while. She wanted to have plenty of time for the two of them to have fun before babies came along. Asterisk. Emma woke before the sun was up the following morning, and she was surprised by the deep ache between her legs. It would remind her all day what the two of them had enjoyed together and make her excited for it to happen again that evening. She was going to like being married very much. She dressed quickly in the cold morning air and immediately went to start the fire. Then she went to the stove and whipped up some pancakes with eggs her mother had given her. It was a meal she'd never made alone, but she hoped she did well with it. She wanted to save what little bacon was left for Sunday mornings, which she thought should always be a good meal. Emma heard Jared stirring just as she flipped the first 4 pancakes onto a plate. "If you want, you can get started on these while I make more. Then you can eat your fill while they're hot, and you can let me know when you're done." She was surprised to see that Jared was walking toward her instead of getting dressed. He grabbed her, kissing her. "I was disappointed to realize you were already awake. I hope to wake you up by making love to you again." "That sounds lovely. I'll wait for you tomorrow. You could wake me up the same way." The tingling between her legs started again. "Perhaps we should eat breakfast and then visit the bed once more." Jared smiled. "We'll make sure to do that." Instead of going back to dress, he took the plate from her, added a bit of butter and the syrup on one shelf, and sat down at the table to eat. She didn't know why, but that made her blush. All they'd done the night before didn't bother her a single bit, but seeing him sit at their table completely naked made her feel embarrassed. "Don't you think you should put some clothes on?" "Why?" "If we're going to go back to bed after breakfast, it feels as if it's wasting time." Jared cut into his pancakes. "We'll pray after the meal this morning." After his 8th pancake, he said, "I think I'm finished." "All right." She flipped the last 4 pancakes onto her plate and moved to sit with him at the table. "We can pray now." He bowed his head and thanked God for their meal and the miracle that was his bride. She was touched by his words. "I'm not a miracle. I couldn't even cook a week ago. But now you know how to make several different meals. And I'm not talking about your cooking when I call you a miracle." She grinned. "I cannot express how much I enjoyed last night. I wish there was time for us to lock ourselves in this cabin and just spend our days lolling about in bed. I never thought I'd pray for a blizzard, but I think it's about to happen," he told her, picking up her hand and kissing the palm. She giggled. "I think you need to have the barn done first, and if we could have just a bit more meat set aside. Stop being logical when I want to make love with you. Let me eat a little breakfast first." She moved her foot to his shin, stroking it with the side of her foot. He groaned. "Eat fast. You're always in such a hurry. Don't you want to take time to smell the roses?" He shook his head. I really don't. Will you be working on the barn again today? She asked, between bites. And she was eating much faster than she knew was healthful, but despite her teasing, she was feeling a bit anxious for their endeavors as well. He nodded. Until it's done. Then we'll hunt as much as we can every day, so we'll have meat for the winter. I know my brother is planning to share anything he hunts with us and your family. Jared shrugged. We'll take him up on it, but it will be nice to not have to worry about meat all winter. Your mom makes wonderful jerky. She does. It wasn't as good as Henry's, but she wasn't going to say that aloud. She would sound envious, and she didn't want to, but she knew she was, deep inside. That will help a lot. Did you learn to salt meat yesterday? He asked. I did, but I'm going back to do more with them today. Next week we'll start alternating who is teaching whom. Henri wants to get better at sewing, and the ladies in my family want to all learn how to cook better. You women folk make me feel like we should be inviting your brother and Pa to work with us, but I'm not sure how that would work. She shook her head. No, you keep doing as you're doing. We ladies will work together. She got to her feet and pulled her dress and petticoat over her head. There was no point in being shy after last night, though she hadn't felt terribly shy then either. You're done eating? He asked. When she nodded, he pulled her toward the bed. What a way to start the day. Asterisk. After finishing the breakfast dishes later that morning, Emma wandered down the hill to Henry's cabin. Jared had promised to bring down all the jars he and his brothers had brought west so they could do more salting of the meat. When she arrived at Henry's, she saw there was a moose hanging from a tree as well. Until that day, Emma hadn't realized just what a good hunter her brother was. She was the first one at Henry's, and Roy was just leaving for the morning. Jared will be bringing all the jars he and his brother brought west. Then we'll have the supplies we need to finish up the salting. If we run out, there are other ways, but I prefer the use of jars. Henri kissed Roy goodbye, blushing. Will you be home for lunch? Roy shook his head. No, Pa and I will just have some jerky and keep working while the work is good. We got a light dusting of snow last night, Emma said, grinning. I love snow. Roy left, putting on his boots outside the house. Emma could hear him stomping into them. Henri nodded, but looked a bit worried. I'm just a little frightened we won't be able to get enough meat in before winter is truly upon us. I know they'll still bundle up and go out, but it's safer for them now. Emma nodded. It is. I shouldn't be excited for snow. But you are, and that's all right. Henri did the breakfast dishes with Emma's help. When is Jared supposed to come with those jars? He said he was gathering them and bringing them down first thing. Emma heard a wagon pull up in front of the cabin. And there he is. Jared had brought Sam to help him carry the jars inside. Henri hurried to the door to open it for them. Emma watched Jared walk into the cabin with 2 crates of the jars, which he deposited on the table. He ignored his siblings and walked over to her, whispering in her ear, I already miss you. You're not alone in that, she whispered back, wishing they really could spend the whole day in the cabin, whether it was proper or not. Sam shook his head at the two of them. You'd think you two just got married or something. Henri hurried outside mumbling something about fetching water to boil the jars. Now look. Sam said. You scared Henri away. He walked back out to the wagon, but he was shaking his head. Emma giggled. We need to get Sam married off, so he'll stop making fun of us. But then he won't have a place to be alone with his bride? Jared grinned. Come to think of it, it would be fun to see Sam tortured that way. You're mean, she said, shaking her head. Bring the jars in and go away. I can't work with you here. I'd be too busy thinking about how good you feel inside me. You just keep thinking that. We'll be alone again this evening. Yes, we will, Emma said, grinning at him. Okay, works for me. Jared hurried to help his brother carry the jars into the house so they could get back to building the barn. He didn't want to ever leave Emma, but there was no choice. Duty before fun. Emma took jars out of the crates while the men finished carrying them inside. When they were done, she said, "Thank you. I think we can take it from here." She picked up a bucket to go out and get some water from the creek. It would be so nice when the ground was soft enough they could dig a well, but for now, toting it from the creek worked. Jared frowned. "Where are you taking that bucket?" "We're going to need a lot of water to wash this many jars, so I'll get a bucket full of water from the creek." He shook his head. "I'll do it. But Henri is doing the same thing." "Why can't I?" "Because you're my wife. I don't think Henri should be doing it either." "Come on, Sam. One more job before we get back to the real work." "I can do it," Emma said, feeling like she was being coddled, which didn't please her a great deal. "You can, but you shouldn't have to." Jared took her bucket and he and Sam headed off toward the creek. Emma shook her head. Apparently, Jared had no idea how strong she was. She'd have to show him what she could do. It had never mattered before that she was capable of a great many things. Now it suddenly was. While Emma waited for the buckets to come back, she unpacked the jars and added another piece of the wood to stoke the fire. She wasn't going to sit around and laze the day away when she could be doing something useful. Henri came back before her brothers, shaking her head. "Pa used to get on those boys all the time when they wouldn't fetch water for my ma and me. And there they are now, refusing to let us do it. What is wrong with them? I swear, my brothers have rocks for brains." Henri looked at the jars that were taken out and smiled when she could see the fire had been stoked. "Do you know if your sisters are coming today to help us with the salting?" "I believe so. I haven't heard anything different." "Good. Many hands make for light work. And I happen to know your brother is hunting again today, so I expect this will be our task all week. I'll teach you to cook something new for lunch, though." "All right. I think that sounds fine, and then I can make that something new for Jared for our supper." "Oh, I was going to teach you to make Johnny cakes, and he only wants to eat them for breakfast. We'll make a soup with some of the meat, and then we won't have to salt it. We'll make enough for supper for Roy and me, and if you want to have a fire outside, we can work on them together." "That sounds good. I've always wanted to know how to make a good hearty soup." "You'll know before lunchtime." Henri frowned. "I do wish Ma had agreed to bring barley. I love it in soup, but Ma said the room should be used for more important things. I've never had it." Henri put as many jars as could fit into her cast iron pot, and then she added water until each jar was covered. She hung the pot over the fire and turned back to Emma. "When I make a soup, I make sure that I use a meat, which I make the broth from either potatoes or rice or barley, and some vegetables. I mix and match with what I have on hand, making each soup a little different from the last, but all are equally good." "The same way you serve jerky and gravy over rice or potatoes?" "Yes. As we get finished processing the meat, we'll have time for me to make noodles, and I sometimes use those instead of rice or barley. I like to have a selection of different things, so no one gets tired of soup. Each one is a little different. My favorite soup is barley, with chunks of beef cut up, and little pieces of carrot. I could eat that for every meal. My brothers tend to get sick of it, though. They like as much variety as we can give them." Emma nodded. "I can't wait to see how you make your broth. I think I understand the rest of the process. What seasonings do you use?" "Salt, of course. Pepper if I have it. I like to use garlic as well, but that will be scarcer here." Henri sighed. "I think we live in a beautiful place, but I sure do wish we had some more spices to cook with. I can understand that. This will be fun. We'll have to hurry with the jars so we will have time to make the soup. Henri bit her lip. Let's make another trip to the creek for water, and then we'll be ready to boil the next batch. I think we should do 2 batches today. Emma picked up one of the buckets the men had brought back, and they walked toward the creek together. The wind was blowing much harder that day, and Emma wished she'd brought her scarf and mittens. Or a hat. She'd always hated wearing hats, but it would keep her head warm as they walked to the creek and back.